Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. From One King West Hotel in downtown Toronto, welcome to the Empire Club of Canada. For those of you just joining us through either our webcast or our podcast, welcome to the meeting. Before our distinguished speaker is introduced today, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our head table guests. I would ask each guest to rise for a brief moment and be seated as your name is called. And I would ask the audience to refrain from applauding until all of our head table guests have been introduced. First, of course, one of our panelists, Louis Koski, co-founder and senior director of Freedman and Koski, former director, Colorado Marijuana Enforcement Division. Shailene Title, commissioner, Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission. Will Stewart, vice president, corporate communications and public affairs, Hiku Brands. Geoff Zochodne, reporter, Financial Post. How did I do? Got it? Okay. Andrea Payne, National Director, Government Relations, Aurora Cannabis Enterprises. Andrew McLeod, President and Chief Operating Officer, Post Media Network Incorporated. Gordon McIver, past President, Empire Club of Canada. Jonathan Zaid, Director of Advocacy and Corporate Social Responsibility, Aurora Cannabis Enterprises. Megan Henderson, Executive Producer, The Growth Op. Mike Van Solen, Managing Principal, Navigator Limited. Len Glickman, Co-Chair of the Cannabis Group, Castles Brock. And my name is Barbara Jessen. I'm the President of Jessen & Company Communications and the President of the Empire Club of Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, your head table guests. It's now my pleasure to welcome our partner for today's lunch, Megan Henderson, Executive Producer, The Growth Op, to the podium to offer today's welcome remarks.
Thank you, Barbara. Hello, everyone. On behalf of The Growth Op and the National Post, welcome and thank you for attending. We're thrilled to partner with the Empire Club of Canada to bring you a dynamic panel on one of today's hottest topics, cannabis legalization. The Growth Op was recently launched just last week to provide a premium destination for cannabis news and views. Our goal is to keep you informed and educated on the news, trends, and innovations within the cannabis industry for both medical and recreational use. We want to drive the conversation around cannabis forward and work to normalize the topic for Canadians. Both the National Post and the Growth Op are proud members of the Post Media family, which is one of the top-ranked networks in Canada for trusted news. Currently, our network reaches 18.7 million Canadians, which is about 64% of the country. It's really important to us that those people can reach our content at any time of day or anywhere they're located. And that's why we continue to invest in the innovation of our digital products and platforms like the Growth Op. Again, I want to thank you for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy the panel. And with that, I'll hand it back to Barbara.
Thank you, Megan. It seems to me there's one question about the issue we are discussing today that hasn't had sufficient consideration. If we legalize everything, what are teenagers going to rebel against? Mood-altering drugs are not a new thing. The earliest known archaeological record for the use of the opium poppy occurred from roughly the same time period that beer and wine first appeared, roughly 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. The proponents of legalization of cannabis for recreational consumption have laid out a number of strong arguments in support. Clearly, prohibition doesn't work. When marijuana use becomes problematic, it is a social, not a criminal issue, and many people have been burdened with a criminal record for fairly innocuous infractions. There is some evidence from experience in Holland and Portugal that legalization may actually help reduce consumption. Those opposed to legalization generally acknowledge the benefits of medical marijuana, but express concerns with some studies showing consumption to be dangerous, particularly among adolescents who use marijuana heavily at ages 16 or 17 and over a period of years. More generally, there is criticism that not enough is known about the long-term impacts on the brain, lungs, and other critical organs to make a call for legalization. Another key argument against legalization is related to to regulating the drug among groups such as drivers, and perhaps more surprisingly, at least to me at least, until I began to consider this, are the issues being raised by environmentalists. To help sort through all these arguments and misinformation in order to better understand what recreational marijuana legalization will look like in Canada, we have convened our panel of experienced experts. Louis Koski is the co-founder and senior director, Freedman and Koski, and the former director, Colorado Marijuana Enforcement Division during the legalization of marijuana. Mr. Lewis played a pivotal role building the first agency in the world to implement medical and retail marijuana policy. Commissioner Shailene Title was jointly appointed Treasurer and Attorney General to the Cannabis Control Commission by the Massachusetts Governor in September of 2017. She co-authored the Massachusetts marijuana legalization referendum and has consulted on state and local marijuana policy around the United States. She was a founding board member of the Minority Cannabis Business Association, and she was also a founding board member of the Marijuana Majority. Will Stewart is VP Corporate Communications and Public Affairs at Hiku Brands. He is a leading public affairs authority on cannabis legislation in Canada. He has developed significant expertise in Canada's legal cannabis space, working with a variety of large ACMPR licensed producers and other leading companies in the sector. Will also sits on the advisory board of LIFT. Geoff Zochodne is a reporter at the Financial Post and has convened the banking and cannabis sectors, has covered the banking and cannabis sectors. He will chair our panel today. Prior to that, he covered Ontario politics as a journalist for Queen's Park. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panelists to the Empire Club podium.
Before we came out here, we had the really unique privilege, I guess, of signing the Empire Club's book. And Barbara mentioned to me that Winston Churchill had been someone who signed the book, and I was thinking to myself, oh, how am I supposed to one-up Winston Churchill in writing in this book? And I just thought to myself, I'll use the word cannabis, because I bet he didn't use that, I would assume, so I might have that one on him. But this came up the other day when we were sort of having a conference call, and I think it was Shailene who said it, and it was that you don't really get too many opportunities to be present at the birth of an entire industry. And that's where Canada's at right now. It looks like in the not too distant future, we are going to legalize recreational cannabis in addition to our medicinal regime. And that is putting pressure on a lot of people to make sure that we get it right. There's a lot of boxes that need to be checked and a lot of things that need to get done before we get there. So I think that this panel is going to be really good to sort of give us some perspective on what other countries and what other states have done, I should say, and try and give us an idea in the corporate world as well, and in Canada, and kind of give us a sense of where things have come from and where we are today. So first, I think we had a bit of an introduction with the biographies and everything, so I think I'll skip that part, and maybe I'll just go to Louis and just get us going right away. Can you sort of walk us through what Colorado's legalized marijuana regime is?
Sure. So it's really it's both a combination of commercialized cannabis sales, distribution, cultivation, and also a part patient-based, where patients and caregivers can grow on their own. What we found over the last few years is that the regulated marketplace is really starting to capture a big part of the consumer's attention, and a lot of the cannabis sales are occurring through the regulated marketplace.
And Shailene, where's Massachusetts at so far? I think you said that they had a target date similar to what we have in Canada of July 1st for the recreational side, but can you just walk us through where that is as well?
Sure. Well, in Massachusetts, we had the benefit of having several states go before us and to be able to look at how Colorado and Washington and other states went and try and learn from that, as Canada is trying to do now. So my agency was appointed from scratch to implement the legalization of marijuana last year, And we have 5 people with 5 different areas of expertise: public safety, public health, government regulation, business, and my C, which is social justice. And over the past year, we've tried to develop regulations that can make this a fair and just industry where people from all different communities, businesses of all sizes, are welcome. So retail sales are set to start this summer, and I expect they will start at a small scale and then grow gradually.
And maybe we'll get Will to give us the lowdown on Canada's system so far, or the idea for Canada's system.
Yeah, so I think, in many ways, Canada is well ahead of the United States, even though we're not legal for recreational consumption now. But in other ways, the United States are way ahead of us. We're, of course, legal for medical cannabis. That is Supreme Court decisions. That's not going away anytime soon. But we're actually on the verge of being the first G7 or even G20 country to legalize cannabis on the national level. And that comes with a lot of distinct advantages that they just don't have in the United States. Interprovincial trade being most notably. In the US, where you're selling cannabis, you have to grow it and process it within that state, because transporting it across state lines would be a federal offense. We can do that easily. Because it's legal on the federal level, it makes research and development on the medical end and medical products a lot easier. It also allows companies here to get significantly bigger in scale because they can access banks and capital markets a lot easier than the United States. And finally, Canada will be a leader on the international stage simply because we can move product from Canada to other countries and intellectual property to other countries rather than being landlocked on a state-by-state basis in the US.
Okay. Maybe we'll go back to Lewis first, because I'm interested in this, because Colorado was really, one of the first jurisdictions, I believe, to actually go ahead with the legalization of recreational cannabis. So when you are so far in front, who did you turn to for inspiration and for advice then?
Well, so we started with basically a blank piece of paper, and I recall when we were first starting to write down some of the regulations, we were like, okay, we have all sorts of ideas and we're going to start with writing regulations, and we were left with, wow, where do we really start to try and get this new book written in what ended up being a pretty short period of time? So what we did is we essentially relied on other regulated industries that were pretty well substantiated. So for example, with processing of licensing and doing background investigations, we looked to the casino gambling industry, where they're renowned for very rigorous background investigations and licensing processes, operational requirements, those types of things. We also looked at alcohol, because in a lot of ways in the US, people try to, even though it's not really possible to do this for a lot of reasons, they try to equate the point of sale of cannabis transaction with the same as being a kind of a liquor transaction, and everything leading up to that tends to conflict with one another, but we still borrowed quite a bit from liquor. So in the absence of any other jurisdictions starting to license commercialized businesses, we relied on a lot of those other heavily regulated industries.
Okay, and before we move on, how has it been so far? Has it been a success? Like, has it met the goals that were sort of set out at the beginning?
Yeah, we had a primary focus when I was in office was to protect public health and safety. And in a lot of ways, we feel like we've been successful to the extent that you can be successful with that. Will said it really well when he was talking about the advantages and disadvantages of federal legalization. A lot of the issues that we were facing with edibles manufacturing and those types of things, those are problems that still continue to persist regardless of what your jurisdictional approvals are. But we were able to really work through a lot of those through really strong public engagement processes, and we were able to leverage pretty much broad support from elected officials to really get off to a good start. I would say, though, a caution, it's far from perfect. Right, we're talking about we're not suggesting that Colorado is the model that everyone should follow. Other than I would pay more attention to the mistakes that we made than some of the successes we had.
Okay, and Shailene, then, when Massachusetts has been going through its process, who did you turn to, and what are sort of some of the goals that have been set out for the state as it heads towards legalization?
We turned to Lewis specifically. And I worked on the Colorado campaign as well, so I think they did an excellent job, but they just didn't have some of the data that we have now. In Massachusetts, as the law and regulations were being written, and we looked at the industry in Colorado, we were very concerned about making sure that access to the industry was available for everyone. I would say in Massachusetts, the three things that we have focused on are first, making sure that we collect data in a way that is open and transparent and available to the other states and countries that want to follow. So we have a research agenda. We've hired someone specifically to collect data. We're toying with the idea of an open data policy where not only would we make reports, but the public would be able to access it directly. Secondly, we are focusing on equity in looking at the way that marijuana prohibition has been enforced against certain communities, not so much others in the United States, and I believe this is the case in other countries as well, making sure that those communities have access to the industry. So our equity program offers technical assistance, fee waivers, other ways to kind of level the playing field. And then the third thing we focused on is what I would call modernizing the industry, because we don't get this opportunity to start an industry from scratch very often. So our regulations include strict environmental efficiency standards, diversity plans, because it is 2018. We want to make sure that women, people of color, veterans, everyone is involved in the industry. So all of our licensees will have to provide that as well. And just offering an opportunity for consumers to feel like they can be conscious, they have enough information, so they will all get test results of their products before they purchase it, and they'll be able to learn which companies have gone above and beyond and have gotten leadership ratings in areas like environmental efficiency, social justice. So those are the main ways that we're trying to differentiate ourselves, but I would say at the core, every country and every state is starting with, let's stop arresting and incarcerating people for this. Let's make sure that consumers can go into a store and buy a regulated product, pay tax revenue, and lift it out of the illicit market.
Okay. And Will, on the corporate side, how's it been for you? Like, who have you been able to talk to, and how's it been so far? We don't have the legislation isn't totally finished yet. It's still, some of the rules are still up in the air. How has that been for you and your company, functioning in that sort of environment?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge amount of uncertainty for us. Our company, Haiku Brands, will operate 20 to 30 cannabis dispensing stores by the end of this calendar year, which by today's standards makes us the largest cannabis dispensing chain in the world, just to put things, and that's only 30 stores. And I say by today's standards because there's competitors of ours who are also opening stores who are in the audience, and I'm sure that they'll be trying to be as big as we are. But we're doing the same thing. We're looking south of the border to see what's worked and what hasn't. I would say that we're envious that they're at the place where they have private sector retail stores operating in Colorado. We believe in a strong role for the private sector. 5 of 10 provinces in Canada believe in a strong private sector retail model for cannabis. Ontario is not one of them, of course, yet. We'll see what we can do about that in talking to the new government. But in other ways, I mean, Canada developed the medical regime to such high standards and with such a great private sector licensed producer model that many countries from around the world are actually looking to us, primarily European jurisdictions, Australia is another example, to see how Canada did it, how they have maintained high production standards, how they have avoided diversion to the black market, how they've ensured that the product is tested and safe for consumption, and manage that entire supply chain at scale. Cannabis is an easy plant to grow. It's a much more difficult plant to grow when you've got a 1 million square foot greenhouse and you can't use pesticides and other tools that are readily at the disposal of other agricultural industries. So other countries who are looking to explore medical or recreational cannabis are actually looking to Canada in terms of how we've done it. And that's a real opportunity for Canadian companies to be those leaders around the world, to have that intellectual property, not just from growing the plant, but lighting systems, control systems, security systems, all have been built to such a high standard here, ironically, under the Stephen Harper Conservative government, which I don't think is on his resume. But it is rather ironic to think that way.
Right. Do you think that Canada's setting itself up for success so far? You mentioned that we've had this medical system in place for a while now, and do you think that it's put Canada on solid enough footing so that when they flip the switch eventually on recreational cannabis, that will be in a good spot to carry that out? Yeah,
I think Canada should be proud of what, and obviously with the stigma around cannabis, we're not singing it from the rooftops, or most people aren't singing it from the rooftops like they would, say, a blackberry or something like that. But Canada has set itself up well to be world leaders in this emerging sector. And let's be honest, the barriers to accessing medical cannabis or even recreational cannabis are falling around the world. Lots of countries are moving in this direction, and it really is something that Canada can lead the way. On the other hand, my American friends can speak more to this than I can, but the development of brands and consumer brands has been extremely strong in US states where it's legal. And those brands have affinity here in Canada. Licensed producers here in Canada are trying to create brands by press release, whereas in the United States, they're building brands and building communities. And that's something that we're behind on, even though we're leading on medical.
Okay, you said the B word, so I'm going to take that and use that to launch into on advertising. I'm curious to hear, what did Colorado do with its advertising regulations around recreational cannabis when that market started up?
Well, so advertising is a really touchy issue, I think, anywhere, because both in the U.S. and in Canada, it's protected almost as free speech, right? So anytime you go to limit advertising, you're opening yourself up for lawsuits. And the way that happens is the legislature says, "Hey, we think you should regulate advertising," and then that agency that gets tasked with that gets sued almost immediately. So we felt strongly, though, that for the industry to really come out of the chute and establish some credibility, that they had to join us in coming up with the right advertising restrictions. So we did what we often did when we dealt with other difficult policy issues like testing and banking and production limits and those types of things. We did public engagement probably to a fault. And so advertising was one of those. And what we actually ended up kind of landing on is the tobacco settlement that came out of the U.S. where it basically, if you have a certain percentage of readership or viewership that is below a certain age, you can't advertise in that type of medium, and it's your responsibility as the licensee to show that you did the due diligence to ensure that you're advertising in the right places. So that was it in a nutshell. That it doesn't mean it's the perfect structure. I don't know that there is such a thing with advertising being so protected. We still had challenges with things like adopt a highway litter sign. So they couldn't advertise in certain venues. So they would do an adopt a highway. We had some of our businesses toyed around with the idea of sponsoring youth sports. And so we as soon as we had those types of activities that were kind of percolating towards us as if that were really going to happen, we would reach out to the industry again in kind of more informal fashion and say, look, do you really feel like this is going to benefit the industry at this point in your existence? Are you going to be able to establish credibility if you do that? So there was a lot of give and take. So for example, advertising at cannabis events that were specific for cannabis, we were a lot more permissive, where on things that were not specific to cannabis and advertising, we dealt with those on a kind of a case-by-case basis.
Okay. And what about in Massachusetts, Shirley?
Yeah, I'd love to speak to that as well because it's such a fascinating question. I think that when you're talking about advertising, there are very common sense items that I think most people would agree with. So something like you have to regulate that these products can't make false, misleading claims, which is often an issue with herbal medicines. We want to have warning labels. Think twice before you use this product if you're pregnant or breastfeeding. And then, of course, the public health experts who had worked in alcohol and tobacco were very clear with our legislators and us as regulators that when adolescents are exposed to advertising, it can make the use more prevalent. So Massachusetts decided to take a cue from Colorado and say if you are going to advertise, you should be able to show that you've done your homework, that for us it's 85% of the audience is of age. But then we also have seen suggestions that to me are just, we don't like you, we don't like marijuana, marijuana is bad, therefore you can't advertise. Something like adopting a sports sponsorship or adopting a highway. Why shouldn't marijuana companies be able to do that if other companies can? It's legal and there's no reason for that restriction. So that's kind of the approach that I took, and we tried to be as reasonable as possible and really make evidence-based decisions in our regulations.
And coming back to Canada, I know we just had the bill come out of the Senate, and I think there was a provision inserted in there that's barring people from making cannabis swag that you can sell or have to promote your brand. So do you need to have that as part of it in Canada?
Yeah, I think we do. And if this is a hockey game between Canada and the U.S., score one for the U.S. for actually having a good sense of branding and advertising. Our company, Haiku, has been developing three main recreational brands for about 3 years. Tokyo Smoke, which won Brand of the Year at the Cannabis Awards in Canada. Yes, there's such thing as Canadian Cannabis Awards. And we have 5 existing storefronts in Toronto where you can buy really nice coffee and really nice paraphernalia, but no cannabis. We have a female-centric brand called Vanderpop, which was started by a 40-year-old mother of 2 who didn't think that anything in the cannabis sector spoke to her. And we have a West Coast health and wellness company called Doja that grows cannabis in the beautiful Okanagan Valley. We've been building those brands for 2 to 3 years each because we knew that in a legal recreational world, branding is going to be significantly constrained. So I think the government really needs to ask themselves the question, if the intent of the legislation is actually to reduce the black market, then why do we have so many restrictions on the ability for us to use the same tools and tactics that the black market is currently using? We have plain packaging. There is no debate about that. In our stores, we can't even put cannabis on the store floor. You have to buy it and then run to the back, get it, and bring it back out. We're not allowed to advertise by and large. We may not be able to print the same T-shirts that you pull out of your Bud Light cases, never mind flashing red lights when important goals are scored. We can't do any of that, but yet we're tasked with getting rid of the black market. And I think, you mentioned the Senate amendment, the swag amendment, as we say. You may only be able to put cannabis branding on cannabis and accessories. We do sell Tokyo Smoke hoodies. They're beautiful. Everyone should have one. But if I sew a smell-proof pouch into the front of my cannabis hoodie, is it now a cannabis accessory and I can now brand it? Right? So I think you're going to find the companies in this space trying to figure out a way to build their brands over time as recreation takes hold.
Okay. Before we go too far, I want to go back and talk about the medicinal side of things, because as we have this rush towards recreational legalization, we've already had the medical market there. We have a lot of LPs that are doing that. How, maybe let's start with Shailene first, and how is Massachusetts protecting its medical users as it gets ready for recreational legalization?
The primary concerns that we heard from patients were that they were worried the adult use market would sort of absorb the medical market, that they wouldn't be able to access their products, their preferred products anymore that worked for their particular conditions. They were concerned about supply, that if there's a supply shortage, that there would be long lines of people over 21 and patients wouldn't be able to access their product. So we took that into account. We were the first state to protect patient supply. So if a company wants to be both a medical and an adult use company, they have to put aside 35% of their products, at least initially, for patients to ensure that there's still enough supply for them. Also, patients don't have to pay taxes on their product because it's a medicine for them, and they have access to larger amounts of the product as well. So we're trying to make sure that as we merge the markets in some ways, that patients are still being respected.
Louis?
So in Colorado, and we're kind of seeing this model play out in a number of places across the U.S., the patients can still grow for themselves. So as Shailene was talking, some of the biggest concerns we heard was access. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that a lot of the rural cities and counties within the state of Colorado said no to commercialized cannabis. And so they were really concerned that if it went to only a commercialized model, that patients wouldn't get access. The other concern that I think they have is that it's not necessarily an easy plant to grow, and it's pretty costly. If patients have the same experience I did trying to brew beer, they're going to want to find a store to go buy cannabis. And so I think there's this interest that patients have in continuing to expand our retail market, because in a lot of ways our commercialized market, even though it's separate doctrine between medical and retail use, are pretty ubiquitous between the two of them. So the more commercialized it gets, the more likely they will have the access they want from the commercialized market, but then there's still the concern over price. We've noticed from data in Colorado that retail cannabis, if it's just considered to be adult use, is much higher in price than cannabis that is being sold to patients. And so I think patients really get concerned then, especially if they're legitimately using it for ailments where it's really helping them, concerned that if the commercialized market gets too strong, then the price will go up and they'll lose access that way.
Can you touch a bit more on, you mentioned the home growing side of things. What did Colorado do on that front?
So that was an evolution of policy because in a lot of ways, the original policy from the early 2000s ended up becoming a commercialized market. So when we decided that we were going to license this commercialized market, there was still this policy that existed through a constitutional amendment in a lot of ways that continued to allow that area or that segment of the industry to still prosper. And what ended up happening, we think, is since the commercialized market took a foothold and a lot of buying patterns changed, that what was kind of like an unregulated gray market turned into an illicit market for moving bulk cannabis outside of the state. So the evolution part was we went from no limits on how much a patient could grow for themselves or they could grow for another 5 patients as a caregiver to limiting it to 99 plants per patient, which is still a ton of cannabis. Not literally, but it's still a lot of cannabis to have. And then we reduced it all the way down to now where you're allowed to only grow 12 plants in a residence, and as soon as you go north of 12 plants, then you have to become a commercialized business.
What about in Massachusetts? What's the plan there for home growing?
Home growing is absolutely allowed for everyone over 21 in Massachusetts. I think that should be non-negotiable in any law.
Has there been any pushback from communities? I know in Canada there's some concern among the provinces and municipalities there in home growing, or has it been a pretty unanimous support for that?
There was some during the legalization campaign, but really nobody can point to any evidence that home growing has caused any kind of problems.
Okay. I want to go back to something you said first before we move on, and that was on the equity side of things. And I think one part of the rationale for the legalization has been the disproportionate impact that drug laws have had on certain communities. And so, can you just go a bit deeper into what it is Massachusetts is doing to ensure that when the system rolls out, it's fair?
Absolutely. So first of all, I think it was really important that our program had to be fair from the start. Otherwise, if you put an equity program, it's akin to just a cosmetic diversity plan that doesn't really do anything. So when we started, we didn't put any caps on licenses because in my experience throughout the US, the states that have said we're going to start with 30 licenses and you all fight for them, that's been really bad for equity and that's been really unfair. So no caps on licenses at the state level, no particular capital requirements so that people just have to show that they are able to run a business, but they don't have to have $500,000 as it's been in previous states. Our application fees are very low. We've seen application fees as high as $30,000 on a non-refundable basis. Our application fees are $500. So we're starting there, and then we go further. People who have either had drug convictions or their parent or their spouse has had a drug conviction, or people who are from communities that we've determined through data studies have had disproportionate rates of arrest and incarceration are going to have technical assistance, fee waivers, and then most importantly, certain types of licenses, social consumption and delivery licenses that can be started with a lower amount of capital. They're going to have first crack at those types. So we just want to make sure that as we get this opportunity, that people of all sizes, businesses of all sizes have access, and we're not trying to penalize any big businesses, but we're trying to make sure there's room for everyone.
On the corporate front, is there a responsibility for companies in Canada to respect the cannabis culture and to sort of ensure that there's fairness to people coming up
Yeah. I mean, I hope there is. I think we owe a huge debt of gratitude as people who are now involved in the cannabis sector. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to the early civil disobedience movement, the medical movement, and Jonathan is here now with Aurora, probably one of the leading advocates for medical marijuana in the country. So please say hello to him. So I hope that there is an ability for other people to be involved in this. The challenge is America has life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think you heard that through unlimited license, low access fees, 99 plans, right? We have in Canada, the equivalent is peace, order, and good government. We love government and we love regulations. Our equivalents are 4 plants, and even that's controversial. Permit fees for storefronts that I've seen, $10,000 to $15,000 per store, just to qualify. If you want to grow this stuff, and my friends from Aurora can tell you this, you're $10 million to get a facility going, at least, depending on the size and scope, just to meet all the Health Canada and government regulations that are imposed on us. And I'm not complaining about it. Cannabis is a controversial product. It's something that we're reintroducing into society after 100 years of prohibition. We need to be able to do it right, and we need to, as an industry, we need to earn the trust of the population. But by the same token, we're treating this plant a lot harsher than we've treated almost anything else coming to market, including things that are already in market, including alcohol, as a perfect example.
Okay. Lewis, how did Colorado ensure that its rec market was equitable in that,
Well, I think that's probably one of the biggest things we missed. And to Shailene's point, you have to, if you want to address that issue, now is the best time when you're at the onset of developing and implementing the policy. So I think in Colorado, we missed really thinking through how communities were impacted prior to legalization. And we were so focused on that blank sheet of paper that we had in front of us that to a large extent, we just missed on that. To our credit, though, I think there's been some change there, and especially with respect to previous convictions for crimes that are no longer illegal in the state of Colorado. There's been a lot of deference paid to people with those types of criminal histories and being able to get them into the marketplace. What we're seeing, though, nationwide is that's kind of exciting, and especially in the social justice issues, is like Massachusetts or Oakland, California, and a number of other jurisdictions. They're really moving this issue to the forefront, which is, I think, where it really needs to be. So we really need to start thinking at the onset, how is it that we can afford minority communities, poor income neighborhoods that have really been the target of the quote-unquote drug war. How do we, to the extent that they want to be engaged in the industry, and what are the best methods for doing that? Is it to have programs for them to be able to have some form of ownership in the company? Is there some criminal justice reform that needs to occur where they can help to be at least employees within the industry? And then are there educational and social programs where in cannabis there's a lot of high-paying, high-aptitude type of positions, scientists and horticulturists and business people, and how do we get the right training for minority communities or members of the minority communities so that they can participate in some of those positions as well?
Okay. And I think on that, we have a few minutes, so I think we can go to the floor for some questions if people have them. I see a hand over there.
I'm wondering if the panelists from Colorado and Massachusetts can speak to banking and how financing the industry is going, because banking in the States, you'd have some that would be provincial, which is different than Canada, although we have a little of that as well, but not with banks per se.
I can speak to that. That's a great question. Banking is absolutely a challenge, probably our biggest challenge now in Massachusetts. Because cannabis is federally legal, most banks, or perhaps all banks, don't want to work with cannabis businesses. And as much as we as regulators have tried to work with them and paid attention to this, we can't force private businesses to do anything. But if you look at it from a common sense perspective, regardless of how you feel about marijuana legalization, if there are going to be marijuana businesses, they shouldn't be working with cash. Law enforcement agrees, neighbors agree, everybody agrees on that. So we do have some federal bills to address this that I hope will do well as this issue progresses and the stigma is reduced. I'll let Lewis speak to Colorado, but one thing I've noticed is that as time goes on, I think that banks tend to change their risk analysis.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the more mature the regulatory framework, the more likely you are to have ample banking services. So we estimate in Colorado about 80% or so of the cannabis businesses in the state are banked. Interestingly enough, though, and I think we talked a little bit about the advantages Canada has versus the advantages the U.S. has. Recently, we were doing some research for a white paper that we wrote, and we talked to a number of money services companies. And one thing we were told is that that money services, so electronic payment for cannabis, is going to continue to be a challenge for quite some time in the U.S. So even though we might have typical banking services, and you'll likely have that with certainty here in Canada, there still might be a challenge within the entirety of North America whether or not there can be a lot of electronic transactions that happen. So the banking issue might transcend into Canada for that reason as well.
Well, I'll just say briefly, like we've got a number of advantages here, but the large mainstream banks that are all around us here on Bay Street have been late to the party on this. They're very apprehensive about getting involved in the sector. We're starting to see that now, primarily with BMO. But the flip side is the credit unions have really had a whole new business line develop that the banks aren't even in. The credit unions are really running the programs in terms of accounts, especially accounts, right now. We've seen a lot of smaller boutique investment houses that have grown quite large, some cannabis specific, but now that again is transferring over into some of the banks. And I think that that's just part of the evolution of cannabis from illegal to legal and moving from the fringes of society to a traditional, to something that looks and acts more like a traditional Canadian business.
I don't know, do we have time for one more? We do have time for one more question if someone from, I see a hand that's coming up, there we go.
Hi, Shalene, I just had a question. Excuse me. You touched upon the environmental aspect, and I don't think a lot of jurisdictions are doing that. I know we're not in Canada for sure. I'm not sure about Colorado, but could you elaborate a bit more on what legislation you have in place for that?
Sure. So Massachusetts is considered a leader in the United States on environmental efficiency. So there was a lot of pressure on us to ensure that the cannabis industry didn't jeopardize that. We also have a Global Warming Solutions Act, which requires a state to cut back dramatically on its energy usage. So within that framework, and also just the fact that it was the right thing to do, we required cannabis companies to basically use LED lighting at a certain wattage standard, depending on their size of 36 or 50 per square foot. And from what I've seen so far, it's really encouraging innovation in lighting. And I hope that other states will follow suit. I will add that we're very open to the idea that this wasn't exactly the right standard. We have a working group in place that is taking public feedback. We're going to revisit it later this year.
I would just add that one thing we've noticed, and this is fairly anecdotal, but the higher the cost of energy, the more likely a jurisdiction is to really focus on some of the environmental impacts. So in Colorado, where the cost of energy is considerably less than what it is in Massachusetts and California, there was less attention paid to the environmental aspects, where in California, Massachusetts, you see much more attention being given that direction.
Will?
I'll just say very briefly, I think that movement is starting in Canada now. I know one of our facilities in the Okanagan Valley, Doja, is moving to things like LED lights and is very concerned about our packaging and biodegradability of that. And I think it is happening. I know folks like Pollution Probe have been asking around about what more can be done in terms of limiting people's footprint on facilities. The irony is the most expensive electricity in Canada is in Ontario, and most of the licensed producers are in Ontario because they're in old manufacturing facilities that sat vacant because the manufacturers couldn't afford the electricity prices and moved to other places. So I think by its very nature it will come because it's good business and good for profitability, not just because of a CSR initiative or a mandated policy.
And on that hydro-related note, I don't know if we have time for one more, or nope, that's the hook. I think Barbara, thank you.
Time for one more? I think Gordon had his hand up. He probably doesn't need a microphone.
You can just fire it in over here.
I think we have time for one more.
Oh boy.
Oh, Mike's coming in.
And of course, advocates like Bill Maher immediately jumped on it and said that's low-hanging fruit, and everybody would be great fans of his that aren't traditionally in his base. In Canada, we've had the impression that demographics of people that use marijuana or choose to use marijuana and who don't use marijuana and will not use marijuana won't change dramatically after legalization. Was that your experience in the United States, or were there surprise demographics that emerged of new users that you were not expecting at all?
Well, I get started on that. I promised my business partner I would not mention President Trump in this crowd, so I'm so happy that I get a chance to do this today, kind of despite him. I would just say that we, across the boards in almost every jurisdiction, we see spikes in use at the onset of sales, and then everything kind of levels off. So the most recent data in Colorado would suggest that men still consume cannabis far greater rates than women, but they haven't changed that much since legalization. And on an encouraging note, some of the most recent data on youth use would suggest that there's a statistical decrease in youth use in Colorado. So I would say that it's going to stay about the same. There's that 80-20 rule where 20% of consumers consume about 80% of the product. We've seen that with cannabis and alcohol and cigarettes, those types of things. So it's going to stay the same. Your demand is what your demand is, and it might grow over time.
I agree with Lewis's analysis. I would just add that I've seen some very interesting data that shows that the method of use can change. So some people would be using, for example, joints or smoking flower in the illicit market, and then once products like tinctures or edibles are available to them, then they tend to change their usage.
Who's going to be the Canadian?
Very, very, very quickly. I think we had raw flower legalized in medicine first, so 100% of patients would consume raw flower. As soon as oil was made legal, we saw almost immediately that the market was split. Now oils are taking up more of the capacity for medical patients. I think we'll see the same thing in recreational use over time, especially once the government legalizes concentrates, vape pens, and edibles in 12 months' time from legalization.
And so on that note, we're going to wrap it up, I think. So,
Thank you. I did tell Lewis at lunch that despite his president, we did let him cross the border this morning. And, well, I don't think Charlene really needed permission because she has family here, and I think it would be remiss if we didn't welcome them. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure having you. I'm pleased to welcome Andrea Payne from Aurora Cannabis Enterprises to thank the panelists.
Thanks everyone for being here today, and thanks to the Empire Club for hosting a really enlightened and educational forum. I think it's really important that we get more information and education out, and hosting discussions like this will bring cannabis to the forefront and have people understand and governments understand the industry a little more. Thank you to our panelists for attending today. It was Aurora's pleasure as well to sponsor the luncheon, and I'd be remiss if I didn't introduce some of my colleagues who are here today. If you could stand up, Xavier, who's our Senior Vice President of Marketing and Promotion, and Shaka, who's here with us as well, who works with Xavier, and Jonathan, who is sitting at my table. And I believe there's an additional person here. Is there? Oh, there's Paula. Paula, if you would stand up. She works with our promotional team, and David. Welcome, David. He's new to our to the Aurora family. One thing we can say about people in the cannabis industry is there's a lot of passion. And the passion, I think Will kind of mentioned it, comes from some of the people that have been in the industry for a long time. They've come from the gray markets. They've come from places where it was illegal on both fronts to be involved in the cannabis industry. But they bring with them a passion that has been joined kind of in a hybrid way in our industry by people like many of us who have joined the industry with our expertise and ability to move companies and the cannabis producers ahead. This passion, I don't know how many of you today are with the cannabis industries. Maybe you could do a show of hands. Who here is with I mean, I think we can all agree that there's a passion there that you don't often see in many other industries today. So congratulations to all of you, and we really are an emerging industry. Just before we sat down for lunch, the way things are going so fast, Quebec just passed their cannabis law, so it will become legal in Quebec to consume. It's been a little bit of a trial in Quebec, but nonetheless, it's passed. So I think there just remains one province and 2 territories left to pass their legislation. And then, of course, the federal legislation, which is now back in the House of Commons. It's an exciting time for the cannabis industry. Legalizing cannabis for consumer use and putting rules around that and trying to push back a vast and sophisticated black market with a legal, regulated, and safer one is really important for Canada. It's an important moment for Canada. It's a good moment for public policy, and it's a good moment for global leadership. Canada is leading the cannabis industry. Just today, Aurora announced that we signed a deal with Anandia. We're really, really incredibly proud of that because they're considered the industry leader in science, genetics, and independent cannabis product testing. Led by Dr. Page, he was the first scientist to sequence the cannabis genome and provide deep insights into the interplay between cannabinoids and terpenes. Anandia intends to expand its R&D, product testing, and product development facilities to meet the domestic and international demand. This is exciting news for Aurora. It's an acquisition that expands our science capabilities and brings deep science into Aurora. And this is just one example. Aurora and other cannabis producers are inventing a new global industry. But more than that, we're leading the way and legalizing cannabis for progress at a global level. And along the way, we're driving important investment, economic development, and employment in Canada and in the world. World leaders today in other countries are coming to us for our expertise. So there's a practical idealism and sense of mission at Aurora and to everyone we bring into the company fold. It's an exciting moment. It's one that that changes and grows and diversifies every day. It's one we're super excited to be involved in, and I just wanted to thank you very much for attending today and for your interest, and I hope you continue to follow our great story. And feel free to speak to any of my colleagues that are here with me today if you have any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea. The Empire Club prides itself on bringing issues to the public forum to share thoughts and experiences, and we wouldn't be able to do it without our sponsors. And so we're so grateful to them. First of all, our event sponsor, Aurora Cannabis Enterprises, thank you so much. Our VIP sponsor, Castles Brock, and of course our event sponsor, the National Post. Thank you all so very, very much. Without sponsors like these great companies, the Empire Club lunches would not be possible. So we're extremely grateful for your very generous support. I'd also like to thank MediaEvents.ca, Canada's online event space, for webcasting today's event for thousands of viewers around the world. So thank you to our sponsors and to Media Events. Although our club has been around since 1903, we have moved on to the 21st century, and we're active on social media. Please follow us on Twitter at Empire_Club, and visit us online at www.empireclub.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and on Instagram. Finally, please join us again for our next event on June 18th, featuring the Ontario Post-Election Political Landscape Panel, taking place at the Albany Club here in Toronto. Thank you so much for your attendance today, and this meeting is now adjourned.